Lord Darmo came here also, through the same sort of strength and perseverance. And through that strength founded Shaolin and made it what it is.
Shaw Brothers was always an international company. Run Run Shaw was brought back to Hong Kong in 1957 to fix the studio there because it had kind of fallen into a backwater. No one cared about it anymore. It wasn't turning out good work. Previously, the Shaw headquarters were Singapore. Their biggest markets were Malaysia. So they had a very pan-Asian view of everything. They managed theater chains all over Southeast Asia.
In the early 60s, Run Run Shaw decided that he was going to expand the distribution of his movies beyond Asia.
Shaw knew what was out there. It had global ambitions, but it had a hard time getting traction outside of Asia.
It started really with Empress Wu, which he entered in the Cannes Film Festival, and also was working on getting that released in Europe and Africa and Middle East.
Japanese movies were coming into the US with the seal of approval from Europe. Rashomon and Kurosawa, they were playing Cannes. They were coming in, and Rashomon in '52 won an Academy Award. These were top quality films. They were playing art houses. They were playing college campuses. They were playing all over the place. Movie clubs were bringing them to smaller towns and venues. So they were everywhere.
I think a lot of the Japanese movies were inspiring people to, at Shaw, to take the action, to take the movies away from the costume epics and do more of the swordplay.
Shaw was trying his hardest. He was giving press conferences saying he wanted to get into the American market in the 60s. He was expanding in Hawaii.
His attitude really was that Hawaii was the gateway to the West.
One of the really interesting things early on with the Shaw films is that when Last Woman of Shang or Empress Wu were playing New York City, they were getting reviews that were really unsophisticated. New York was only used to Japanese films. Meanwhile, these movies like Empress Wu and so on were playing Hawaii. And the Hawaiian critics, they were pretty aware and pretty savvy of Asian film. They knew Chinese film. They knew who the actors were. They knew who the performers were. They didn't even mention whether movies were subtitled or dubbed or what language they were in, because they were used to dubbing, they were used to subtitles, they were used to all these different languages. It was much more cosmopolitan there. And so they got much more favorable reviews in Hawaii.
This coincided with his daughter Violet marrying a businessman in Honolulu named Paul C.T. Liu, who worked for Dean Witter. Violet moved to Hawaii, and her husband became the representative in Hawaii for Shaw Brothers. And in 1963, the first movie that they released there was Madam Whitesnake. And they made a deal to show their movies in the Princess Theater first, and then eventually they made a deal for a lease with a theater called the Liberty in the late 60s. But they ran them in several different theaters in Honolulu throughout the 60s. The American Theater was another one that had a license with the Shaws to show those movies. Shortly after that, 1964, a gentleman named Frank Lee in San Francisco, who hosted a radio show called Voices of the Orient, made a deal to distribute the Shaw Brothers movies in the continental US on an art house basis. He thought to bring those movies to an art house crowd would be an interesting way to introduce Shaw Brothers to the United States. The first movie they showed at the 55th Street Playhouse was Last Woman of Shang, which was the most expensive, biggest Chinese production to date.
What really put Shaw on the map was their new color wuxia offensive. The wuxia were swordplay movies, basically. And the first one was The One-Armed Swordsman. It was also a same part of a package of movies that Shaw was doing in this new wuxia offensive that included King Hu's Come Drink With Me. Frank Lee was so excited about Come Drink With Me. He was really talking it up. And they could see the numbers in America and on the Chinatown circuit start to tick up. One-Armed Swordsman was doing well, as they did more and more of these movies with Chang Che and Jimmy Wong Yu, as they brought in more and more of these action films, they started to see them get traction in the US.
It being New York, there were always going to be people who were interested in international films anyway. So he thought there was a pretty good chance that these would do pretty well. And it turned out that the attendance was 50% non-Asian.
Finally, something was working. Shaw had tried to tour his actresses. He had tried press conferences. He tried everything. This was what was working, but it still wasn't breaking out of the Chinatown circuit.
You know that is not the way. Xiao, you mustn't despair. Try that one more time. Concentrate now.
At that point, Shaw Brothers was producing, like, on average 40 movies a year, which is like 3 or 4 times what a Hollywood studio was doing at that time in the late 60s.
What really, really got Shaw to go big is the same thing that eventually would lead to Shaw's destruction. And that was the moment that Run Run Shaw lost control. And it's the moment he couldn't land a contract with Bruce Lee. When Bruce Lee came back to Hong Kong and tried to negotiate a film deal for himself, he was kind of a nobody with a sort of supporting part in the Green Hornet to his name. He was a kung fu coach to the stars. He tried to negotiate a deal with Shaw Brothers, but Shaw found him arrogant. Bruce Lee wanted what Shaw would give no one: control. He wanted to control his image. He wanted to control his movies. He wanted to pick his material. Shaw was used to people who did what they were told. And that insistence on rigid control is why some of his employees, Raymond Chow and Leonard Ho, broke away and formed Golden Harvest, the first serious upstart competition to Shaw. And Golden Harvest, they were fine with sharing control. Bruce Lee wanted a cut of his movies. He wanted to be a producer. He wanted to have a say in his material. Golden Harvest needed a star, and Bruce had something, so they gave it to him. And he started turning out hits for them. Run Run Shaw really, really wanted to compete. And it must have burned him to no end that his biggest hit in the West came because of Bruce Lee.
So in March of 1973, Warner Brothers put out The Five Fingers of Death, and this was kind of an experiment for them to see how a martial arts movie would do ahead of Enter the Dragon, which was in production at that time. And they had been looking at, like, the numbers, the ratings for Kung Fu, and things seemed to be building toward some kind of a martial arts boom.
Five Fingers of Death was a pop culture phenomena. People were imitating what they saw on screen. Tatum O'Neal was doing a promotional push for Paper Moon at the time and declared in a press conference that her favorite movie ever made was Five Fingers of Death. It was huge.
The numbers just attracted so much attention from other distributors, and it really became a craze.
For 1 week in the United States in the summer of '73, the number 1, 2, and 3 movies at the box office, according to Variety, were Angela Mao's Deep Thrust, Five Fingers of Death from Shaw, and another Golden Harvest film, Fists of Fury, which is a retitling of Bruce Lee's The Big Boss. It probably stung a little bit for Shaw that he only had one of those movies to his name, and the other 2 were from the competition. Everyone wanted Bruce Lee, and the fact was, in the middle of 1973, Bruce Lee died. He died even before Enter the Dragon came out. There was no other Bruce Lee, but everyone was rushing to market with Bruce Lee biopics. They were rushing to market with Bruce Lee imitator films, and American distributors were snapping them up.
One distributor who noticed these numbers was a Boston-based distributor, exhibitor named Seraphim Karalexis, worked for a company named United International. And he called his sub-distributor in New York one day, Howard Mahler, asked him, how the numbers were on their latest Swedish, I think, sexploitation movie. United International released a lot of these European softcore movies. And Howard Mahler said, hey, it's doing all right, not as well as this Chinese picture. He wasn't sure, like, where this movie came from. He stuck around to the end credits and saw that it was made in Hong Kong by the Shaw Brothers. So he jumped on an airplane, called up and said, "My name is Seraphim Karalexis. I'm a producer, distributor from the United States. I would like to meet Run Run Shaw." They sent over a car, went there and watched trailer after trailer. He didn't have time to watch a full film or go through 20 or 30 movies. He just wanted to see trailers. He was looking for specifically open-handed combat. Found the Duel and said, "That's it, that's what I want," and made a deal with the Shaw Brothers, and a few days later flew back to the US with the film. So he called ahead to his partners and he said, "Look, I have the movie. I'm going to be flying back in a few days. We have to work, and get this ready to go because we want to have the second movie." So they grabbed like a Japanese American cab driver, took a picture of him in his karate gi, and just put together a quick ad campaign. And he got a booking at the Loop Theater in Chicago on Easter Sunday, April 22nd, 1973. 3 weeks after seeing Five Fingers of Death at the Savoy Theater in Boston, he had Duel of the Iron Fist in the Loop Theater in Chicago. 3 weeks.
You have very sharp reflexes, and that can win a great many battles.
The movies were getting cheaper and cheaper. The money they were making was getting less and less, but the game was Bruce Lee. And so Shaw actually made an attempt to get in on it with a movie called Bruce Lee and I, which is a really mean-spirited Bruceploitation movie, which basically is a movie about Bruce Lee getting drunk a lot, having sex with a lot of women, and owning a big round trampoline bed with a golden comforter on top. So it wasn't the best view of Bruce. In fact, I think charitably you could say this was maybe Run Run Shaw pissing all over Bruce Lee's grave. Maybe a little spiteful, maybe not the best look for one of the biggest movie producers in the world.
When King Boxer was released as The Five Fingers of Death by Warner Brothers, one of the main powers behind that deal was a gentleman named Wolf Cohen, who had been the head of Warner Brothers International for a long time. He started at that job in 1944. And so by 1973, he knew people all over the world in the film industry. He had been the best man at Shaw's daughter's wedding in 1961. And Howard Mahler saw how much money Seraphim was making on the movies that he was sub-distributing for him, so he started picking up some of his own martial arts movies, like The Bamboo Brotherhood and The Mandarin Magician. Eventually he went to the Shaw Brothers and he got Killers on Wheels and Killer Snakes.
But after that, Run Run Shaw decided that co-productions were going to be the big thing. That was what was going to elevate Shaw. Five Fingers of Death made $1.5 million in Italy. So when Shaw was looking for countries to make co-productions with in the West, Italy seemed like a really good idea. The first one was a movie starring Lo Li, the star of Five Fingers of Death, trying to make lightning strike twice. It was called Superman Against the Orient, and did okay. It was a comedy. It did fine. No one was embarrassed, but it wasn't a blockbuster. It wasn't a Five Fingers of Death. They followed it with another comedy that did okay, but not great, and then they continued the Superman movies. They did Superman Against Amazons, which was released in the US by AIP as Super Stooges versus Wonder Woman. The movies weren't getting a lot of respect.
The key film, I think, after Duel of the Iron Fist was Seven Blows of the Dragon, because it was this big film adaptation of a famous Chinese novel called The Water Margin, and it was the first part of this epic. And so it was a long movie, and Roger Corman at New World Pictures got the movie and cut like half the running time out of it. And then he had the Shaws film a nude scene, because that was pretty much what New World Pictures needed. They needed R-rated sex and violence. They put together this US version of The Water Margin, which they ran like 80 minutes or 85 minutes, and put that out as Seven Blows of the Dragon. And it did really well, but I don't think it made the Shaw Brothers too happy
Then they tried to team up with Warner Brothers directly again and make a blaxploitation movie. Because in the US, what a lot of distributors had discovered is that the audience that was really loyal to Kung Fu movies, as they got more downscale in the 70s, as they sort of lost that early 1973 shine and sort of became movies that were considered, kind of corny, but the black audience was still there. And it was partly because there were several black martial artists like Ron Van Cleef and later on Carl Scott who were working in these movies. Jim Kelly was still making martial arts movies. But the black audience was really, really loyal. And so a lot of theaters that played to an urban audience would actually have a pretty even split between Kung Fu movies and blaxploitation flicks. So what made better sense than Warner Brothers and Shaw to get into business together to do a blaxploitation martial arts movie set in Hong Kong? They made Cleopatra Jones and the Casino of Gold, another movie that underperformed and underwhelmed. And so in 1978, he went all in. He'd already put millions into doing a co-production on Taipan, which was the sequel to Shogun, the hit miniseries. It had been a huge hit in the US. It was shot on Shaw Brothers Studios to some extent, and Shaw went in on it and did okay. Then he decided to go all in with AIP, Samuel Z. Arkoff's company, with a $16 million investment in a movie that no one thought could fail. It's directed by the director of The Poseidon Adventure. It starred James Bond himself, Sean Connery, Natalie Wood. This thing was going to be a special effects extravaganza. It was called Meteor, and it was a huge bomb. $16 million was not a sum of money Shaw Brothers could afford to lose, and losing it seemed to really send Run Run Shaw reeling. Ironically, and pretty painfully, 1978 was also the same year that another Shaw misstep came back to bite him when an actor they'd not decided to work with before, again, just like Bruce Lee, began to make the hit movies that would turn him into a star, that would make him one of Golden Harvest's shining jewels, and turn out some of the biggest hits of the 80s. 1978 was the year that Jackie Chan released Snake and Eagle's Shadow, which set an all-time box office record in Hong Kong, blowing Bruce Lee's hits out of the water. He followed it up the same year with Drunken Master, another record-setting hit. After that, he wouldn't go to Shaw. Who would? Shaw was on the way out. You could smell it. He went to Golden Harvest. That's where the new stars were getting made.
In 1978, a company called Cinema Shares was branching out into television, putting together TV packages. One of the executives there was a man named Mel Marin.
Mel Moran at Cinema Shares had noticed that all these suburban kids, white kids, wanted to see the martial arts movies. The martial arts movies were playing mostly to black audiences in mostly what were known as urban houses or inner city houses. These were sort of rougher. White parents were scared of them. They'd seen what went on in them in Midnight Cowboy. They were keeping Junior away. So these white kids wanted to see the movies. Kids from the suburbs wanted to see the movies, but they couldn't. And so Mel Moran thought, if I can't bring the kids to the grindhouse, I'll bring the grindhouse to the kids.
But he had been working with Toho through his association with Henry Saperstein at UPA, who was importing a lot of the Godzilla movies in the 60s and early 70s. So Mel Marin had brought Godzilla to Cinema Shares through his association with UPA, and Mel Marin didn't seem to think that there was a difference in that. He said, we've got a Sonny Chiba karate movie, The Killing Machine, is in one of our TV packages here at Cinema Shares. Why can't we just put some of these Chinese movies on TV also?
He was the best. He killed the rest. The master killer, the master of the martial kung fu art. Revenge drove him on. Vengeance would be his. The Manchu warlords would pay for their crimes. See the master killer, the greatest artisan of kung fu. He is the best. The Master Killer, rated R from World Northall.
Marin left and took this deal with him. And he also made a deal for a few Golden Harvest movies. Beginning in the spring of 1979, World Northall, which was this independent company that up to that time had specialized in art films. One of their big hits was Cousin Cuisine, which had made millions. From the moment Mel Marin got there, they really became the exclusive distributor for the Shaw Brothers. And what would happen is the movies would come out and play in theaters, and then 6 months to a year later, they would go to television in these packages called Black Belt Theater.
And suddenly, kids across America were watching Shaw Brothers movies. They were making 5 Venom masks out of paper bags. They were playing, 36 Chamber, or Master Killer really, games. They were talking about Shaolin Temple.
The Black Belt Theater packages started selling in February of 1981. The first market was LA at K-Cop. And from there, it just spread out across the country. In New York, the movies were shown on Saturday afternoons under the banner Drive-In Movie. And they became so popular that after a while, they just ran 2 movies. It was the whole afternoon on Channel 5. They did so well that Black Belt Theater 1 and 2 grossed $6 million by the time the third one was being shown in international markets. They kept building markets over the years. So by 1985, they were in 80 markets.
As that got bigger and more widespread though, the movies in the packages were working through the Shaw library and working into the independent movies because everyone suddenly had to have a television package. And so a lot of the movies were getting cheaper. The dubbing wasn't quite always the best. The pan and scan sometimes looked a little crummy. They were working maybe from dupes of dupes down the line at the smaller regional stations. And they were getting a reputation for being kind of cheap and kind of sloppy and kind of half-assed.
Most of these movies, at least the Shaw Brothers ones, were all widescreen. They were all shot in Shawscope. So they would have to be pan and scan for the TV ratio, and then they would mostly be cut for violence. And still, even after being cut for violence, they were incredibly violent. I remember watching Killer from Shantung, and the whole last 20 minutes of that movie, it's just like people getting axed and fighting with hatchets hanging out of their stomachs, and it was the bloodiest thing I've still to this day that I've seen on commercial television.
And what happened as the 80s progressed is the product was beginning to be thought of as cheaper and cheaper. And there came a point, it was also violent. It was being edited for violence. There was a lot of outcries about violence on TV. That stuff was getting cut or changed. Parents were using it to push back against television stations airing these violent martial arts movies.
But a gentleman by the name of Larry Bensky was the TV editor on these World Northall Black Belt Theater packages. And he had started with Mel Marin at Cinema Shares in the late 70s. One of his first jobs at Cinema Shares was to cut Godzilla vs. Megalon down to 48 minutes. So it could be shown in a 1-hour time slot with inserts of, during the commercial breaks, of John Belushi in a Godzilla costume hosting the show.
And so you began to have television stations sort of the late 80s thinking, why are we paying money for these packages of films that we sometimes step in it with, that we're showing at late night, when we could be showing, selling this airtime to commercials?
And I reckon that it's okay. Sure, we just want to run our own business.
At this point, Shaw seemed to be reeling. He didn't seem interested in the movies anymore. His mistress, who later became his wife, Mona Fong, had come in and he'd put her in charge of production. She was very effective, but she always had her eye on the bottom line. But she would do sort of boneheaded things, like she alienated Chung Chang-hwa, the director of Five Fingers of Death, because she demanded that the art department cut its budget in half by cutting all their props and costumes in half. So Chung Chang-hwa came in one day, his 6-foot spears were suddenly 3-foot spears. His floor-length robes were suddenly knee-length robes. They were saving money on fabric, and Mona Fong insisted it be this way. He stormed out and wound up working for Golden Harvest. So penny wise, pound foolish, but that was the Mona Fong way. Run Run Shaw was more and more hands-off. Mona Fong was more and more hands-on, and she had good taste. She really tried to bring in some independent directors, female directors, really take some chances as the 70s progressed, but they never paid off at the box office.
There were some issues with Shaw Brothers right around that time, and the production was slowing down, and eventually it stopped.
In 1980, the same year Run Run Shaw took over at TVB, was the year that Cinema City formed. Cinema City was a production company that would go on to make some of the biggest hits in Hong Kong in the 80s. contemporary action comedies that were aimed at the growing yuppie audience. As the 80s progressed, TVB started renting a lot of the sound stages at the Movietown lot. They were shooting more and more indoors, whereas Shaw was trying to shoot more and more on location to seem more contemporary and with the times. Slowly, the Shaw side of Movietown went dark, while the TVB side seemed to be running 24 hours. In 1980, when Shaw took over TVB, he inadvertently became his own worst enemy. Shaw had always believed in actor training programs. They discovered some of Shaw Brothers' biggest stars doing that. And now he doubled down on actor training at TVB. And instead of minting stars who would go on to work at Run Shaw's company, Shaw Brothers, making movies, he made stars who would go on to work with everyone but Shaw Brothers. People like Tony Leung, Chow Yun-fat. Everyone who would become big later started at TVB, and none of them dreamed of working for Shaw Brothers. In 1986, Shaw, after issuing a series of articles that said Shaw was stronger than ever even though production was down, they didn't need to make so many movies because their movies were hits, they pulled the plug on their movie production. Famously, and this is a rumor, who knows if it's true, but when they pulled their plug, Lau Kar-leung, one of their hit directors, was in mainland China making Martial Arts of Shaolin with Jet Li. Shaw pulled the plug on production so suddenly and precipitously that apparently the Martial Arts of Shaolin crew was left stranded in China with no money for tickets home. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But it makes a pretty good story of how quickly this happened and how suddenly Shaw made this decision.
And so for later packages, like the last one, Black Belt Theater 5, they went all the way back to One-Armed Swordsman to fill out that package. So they went from 80 markets to 4 within a couple of years, and that was pretty much the end of World Northall.
At the same time that was happening, a lot of cities were looking around and saying, why are the hearts of us? Why is the Loop in Chicago, the Combat Zone in Boston, Times Square in New York? Why have we turned over this potentially lucrative property tax base to theaters that are showing, porn basically, porn and violence? And so there began to be these big urban revitalization campaigns to clean up Times Square, to clean up the Combat Zone, to make this a more viable tax base for the city. And eventually these theaters were run out, and corporations like Disney and Viacom came in and took over, basically taking out minority-owned businesses to replace them with businesses that were largely white and employed mostly white people to provide more tax base for the city. As the grindhouses went, as the airtime for the martial arts packages on TV went, as the bootlegging increased, slowly the martial arts movie in America died. The same way that in Hong Kong, Shaw Brothers died.
My brothers, rest in peace. We'll carry on with the cause. I swear, we will.
In the fall of 1985, a bootleg company called SB Video surfaced in New York. No one really knew who was behind SB Video, but eventually it came out that SB Video was started by a 16-year-old Puerto Rican kid named Johnny Ray Gasca. He would go to different video stores and some of the less reputable video stores around the city that would rent out bootleg tapes. He would provide the tapes for them, and so he was making, like $400 a week. He was also working for Family Video, which was on the corner of 8th Avenue and 42nd Street. And once he started these SB Video bootlegs, they put up a display in Family Video, and they were selling these tapes for like $59, $59.99 for a tape, which he was getting from various sources. I mean, some of them he taped off of Drive-In Movie. Others he got off of like WHT, which was Wametco Home Theater. World Northall had sold some of the Shaw Brothers movies to WHT. So Johnny Ray Gasca was getting them from WHT, from Showtime, from Drive-In Movie on Channel 5. Eventually, Johnny Ray was getting the tapes directly from World Northall, from Larry Bensky's assistant, who just thought that these kids were martial arts fans. He didn't realize that there was bootlegging going on, and 8 Diagram Pole Fighter was leaked from the World Northall office. It had not been aired yet, but this was an uncut copy of it under the World Northall title of Invincible Pole Fighter. Someone from World Northall happened to be walking by a video store, walking to work from Port Authority, and walked by and saw Invincible Pole Fighter in the window and said, "Hey, wait a minute." They were in the process of doing My Young Auntie at that point when this was discovered, and so the office was shut down, the editing suite was shut down, and the remaining films were all prepared for TV someplace else. The SB Video problem, I think that had a significant impact on the company.
Huh? I'm a rice grinder, so what on earth could I do? Nothing at all. So let's go for a drink, huh?
Shaw Brothers, overall, had a great run. They started in the 1940s. They made huge hits, huge hit melodramas and romances, dramas and action movies, all throughout the 50s and 60s, before their color wuxia offensive in 1967 came out with One-Armed Swordsman, which really changed action filmmaking for good. And after that, it was hit after hit. Shaw was the birthplace for so many directors and actors and films and trends, but it couldn't keep up with the times. And right from '73 was when it began to put its feet wrong again and again as it tried to break these foreign markets. And then television would become its hope, leading it to abandon film and embrace TV fully, which at least gave it a future.